Okay, and I think we are live. Hi everyone, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Nicki. I'm an author and editor, and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading, and all the other things I love. We're talking about reading today because it is the end of the month, pretty much, and it's time to wrap up some of the books I've been reading during June and tell you a bit about them, which ones I recommend. I can't speak today. Also, as it's halfway through the year, I will be doing a little quick roundup just on where my reading's at in terms of challenges and bits and pieces as well at the end. So let me get this banner out of the way now. There we go. Okay, so we've got a few to get through as usual, so I'll kick us straight off. I'm going to start with some that I received back in Christmas birthday gifts, and I finally got around to reading them. I've got one left that I'm going to be starting in the next couple of days, and then I've done all my Christmas and birthday reading from December, and I'm up to date. So I'm going to start with those, and then once I've done those, everything else I read this month was from NetGalley. So I will then do group all those together for you. So mostly this was classics that I got for Christmas. So first up was War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which I did read, I think, a few years ago, back when I was a teenager. Well, more than a few now. I still feel much younger than I actually am. And I gave this 4 stars. It's not a bad read. It's not my absolute favourite, but it has its moments. The style of the prose kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat, wondering what's going to happen. And if you haven't read the book, maybe you know the stage show or films, it's worth checking out. Next up was The Black Tulip. I told you I can't speak today. The Black Tulip by Alexandre Dumas. This was again a 4-star read for me. This is a bit of a sort of adventure story, but historical romance. I'm not entirely sure how to class this one. The basic premise is there's a young man who loves growing tulips, and he wishes to win a competition to grow a pure black tulip. However, in the middle of this, because of his connections with some figures who were political prisoners recently, he is suddenly arrested on false charges, or incorrect charges, perhaps we should say, and stuck away in a prison where he makes friends and forms a romance with the jailer's daughter, who eventually helps him to grow his tulips while in prison. At the same time, there's another rival tulip grower who isn't as gifted as he is and wants to steal the tulip from him and claim it as his own. So there's a little bit of action and adventure in it, but mostly it's just a sweet romance, a little bit of a political story at times. But it's a really easy read, as with most Dumas books. This one's perhaps a little bit more cliched than some like The Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo and the like. But it's a fairly short one and it's good fun. So if you haven't read any Dumas and you're perhaps put off by some of those bigger, thick tomes, this is maybe a nice one to start with, just to get an idea of his writing style. Next up, Chekhov's complete short novels. Prior to this, my knowledge of Chekhov was restricted to his plays. And I'd been thinking for a while I'd like to read his novels and short stories because they do get such excellent reviews, particularly his short stories. He's meant to be quite a master short story writer. So the short stories I still need to get to, but I have read now his 5 short novels. And this was a 5-star read for me. 2 of the stories were particular favourites of mine. The other 3 were still enjoyable. They're well-written pieces, nice and tight, good pacing, interesting characters. If you like sort of late 19th century Russian literature, definitely check them out. Next up, moving from Russia back to Paris, with The Belly of Paris by Émile Zola. Zola is a writer I really enjoy. He writes such atmospheric prose that really embraces all the senses. I mean, in this book, where the story is set in Les Halles, which is the sort of market area, and we really get a great sense of the sights and smells and atmosphere of the markets through his descriptions. A good story, again, intriguing characters, well written, nicely paced, and this is The Belly of Paris is actually part of his really long cycle of 20-odd novels. which I had intended to read from start to finish, but this is actually, I think, book 3. But this was the one that my mother bought me for Christmas. So I was like, well, I'll read it and I'll have to go back to 1 and 2. I don't think it actually matters too much which order you read them in. It's just they all revolve around the same family in some aspects. So I will go back to 1 and 2. But The Belly of Paris, in the meantime, is a 5-star read for me. Excuse me. And the last classic was Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott. And this one is about a 3.5-star read for me. It's not my absolute favourite of Scott's novels. I don't mind Scott, but he's not one of my top writers. I find him a little bit wordy at times. And sometimes that Scottish accent, the way it's phonetically written out, is a little bit tiring. But on the whole, it was an interesting story. It's kind of based loosely on history, but from very much a fictional perspective. And if you like historical novels, historical novels, perhaps we should say, because obviously this is Scott writing historically, but he's now historical. So historical novels, check out Rob Roy. And the final one from my December book haul is Russia by Martin Sixsmith. So this is a non-fiction history book about Russia. For me, this was a 3-star read. I definitely got a sense in this book that we were meant to think, perhaps I should just say that the author is a journalist, and I think his point of view and his preference for one side over another definitely came across in the book. And I think that was a mistake. You want to be a bit more subjective with history. And also, I was disappointed because I'd been looking forward to reading a lot more about Russia's historical past, the medieval period, the early days. And that was kind of all done within a third at most of the book, with the most of the time dedicated to Bolshevik onwards, which for me, I'd hoped for a little bit more time spent with those medieval rulers and the Romanovs, and that was all kind of zoomed through in super light speed in order to concentrate on Stalin and Lenin and the like. So a bit of a disappointment, but if you don't know anything about Russian history, it's maybe an okay place to start, and you can see then what sections interest you and what you want to research further. Sorry, that's my phone pinging away in the background. Let me look through. Where am I up to? Ah, yes, The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zhen Cho. Hopefully I'm saying that right. I'm very bad at Chinese pronunciation, by the way, so bear with me. This was a 4-star read for me. Now, this is a novel which, again, I'm going to attempt some Chinese pronunciation, a wuxia novel, sort of fantasy martial arts. Although I was actually surprised that element of it wasn't as heavy, the martial arts side wasn't as heavy as I expected it to be. It was really more of a fantasy story with a bit of fighting action going on. The main premise of this story is a young woman who's a member of the Order of the Pure Moon. She joins a group of thieves, and they end up fighting to protect this sort of sacred magical artifact. I thought it was a good story. It had some interesting themes with fairly deep reflection on matters like identity and belonging and fighting for survival, particularly considering this was only a novella. It's only a fairly short piece. I thought the characters were great. They all had their own little personality quirks. So even though we didn't spend a huge amount of time with them, you kind of got a sense that they were all individuals and got a really good idea of them as a group as well. So I think I'd recommend this to fantasy fans looking for something a little bit different. That's a quick read. And if I saw more by this author in the future, I definitely would check it out. So moving along. Oh yes, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This one was a 4.5-star read for me. So this is a book that's a kind of Gothic, dark Gothic story. It's set in Mexico. It's one of those stories where I can't give away too much of the tale. It went in a very different direction than I thought it was going to go, I would say. There was quite a twist near the end, which took it on a slightly more fantastical bent than I'd anticipated. But I enjoyed that. It did take me by surprise, which I liked. It didn't just follow the pattern I expected. I thought the heroine was a great character. And I actually quite like Silvia Moreno-Garcia's writing. This is the third book of hers I've read now, and they've all been really entertaining reads. So if you're looking for a Gothic story that's a little bit different than normal fare, definitely check out Mexican Gothic. Next up, I read The Angel of the Crows by Katherine Addison. Now, this is an interesting story. This is a book that started life, I believe, as Sherlock fan fiction. And it's basically a retelling of Sherlock Holmes stories, but the Sherlock Holmes character is an angel. Yes, I know. And all in all, it's a little bit bizarre. And I gave it 3.5 stars. Where this fell down for me was the fact that it was the very, very familiar Sherlock Holmes stories. So it's the ones that everyone knows, The Hound of the Baskervilles, Study in Scarlet, all the ones that Sherlock actually did, the BBC series as well. So even if you hadn't read the original books, if you'd watched Sherlock, you'd know the stories. And although there's these fantasy elements added, with Sherlock being an angel and various other things, at the same time, because the stories are so familiar, you know exactly what is going to happen with each episode. And this was a single book that kind of just went through all these cases one after the other. And for me, there was no suspense, no tension, because I already knew the outcome of all these plot lines. And even though I wouldn't necessarily know all the fantasy twists on it, it still didn't leave much for me to anticipate. At the same time, there's kind of a Jack the Ripper investigation that goes on as well. So there is that's a new element. But if you're a huge Sherlock fan, then you'll probably like this. But for me, it felt like fan fiction. And I have nothing against fan fiction. I enjoy reading it. I write a bit of it. But for it to be a published novel like this, I kind of wanted it to give me something a little bit more. If I wanted to read this kind of story, I could just go on Archive of Our Own and read them. I think it needed a little bit more if it was going to be a major published work like this. But that's just my opinion. If you're a big Sherlock fan, you probably will find lots to enjoy in it. Moving along, we're getting there. I think we're a good halfway through. So, Chosen Ones by Veronica Roth. Now, I believe this is the first book in a planned series. For me, this was a 3.5-star read as well. I actually really enjoyed the premise of this story. So this is a group of people who were chosen to defeat the ultimate evil bad guy. But the story takes place after that happened. They've defeated him, and it's like, well, what do they do with their lives now that their purpose is over? And they've all got very different approaches, the team of people, to this. Some of them have coped with it by becoming celebrities. Others have become more insular. And I thought that was a really fascinating idea, because so many superhero type stories are about defeating the bad guy, and we never see the aftermath of what happens when it's all over. So I thought it had a lot of promise, but it didn't quite come together in the way I hoped. There was some great setup for potential tension between one of the characters, probably the one we'd call the main character, and the old bad guy who may or may not actually be dead. But it kind of fell flat. There was loads of potential there, and I was really interested to see where that was going to go, but then it kind of petered out. There were one or two things that took me by surprise, but on the whole, I think I just wanted more from it. It's like such a fascinating idea, and yeah, I didn't feel it was explored to the extent it could have been. Perhaps that's the best way to put it. Also, I kind of felt that book one concluded. To me, the way it ended was an end, and yet apparently there's going to be another, at least one, maybe two more books, and I can't see what there is more to say, really, after the way this one ended. So I'm not sure that I'd rush out to read the book two, but we'll see. Next up was The Career of Nicodemus Dyzma by, and I'm going to attempt this name, and it's Polish, and please forgive me. Dotega-Mostowicz is the surname. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the first name. Apologies out there if I'm mangling your language. This was a 4.5-star read for me. The premise of this book is great fun. Nicodemus is a nobody. He's living hand to mouth, essentially. But one day he picks up off the street an invitation to this glitzy event. And he's quite hungry, and he thinks there'll be free food. So he decides the invitation doesn't have a name on it, so why won't he just go and check it out and get something to eat and then leave? However, at the event, various people, in the way that high society does, are determined that they must know him. So they attribute him all these wonderful qualities and assume he's someone important. And he realizes he can play off this, and he keeps playing off this, and eventually he ends up becoming more and more powerful, acquiring all these positions in government, all the while just carrying on pretending to be this person he is, and stringing everyone along with him, until, of course, inevitably someone from his past rocks up and threatens to destroy it all. This was a really entertaining read. It was funny, but also, quite thought-provoking and a bit of a social commentary at the same time. I highly recommend it. It's a very short piece, but definitely worth checking out. Next up was A Court of Roses and Thorns by Sarah J. Maas. Now, this is a series that's been around for a while. It's just being re-released in new editions, I believe. So that's why it ended up on NetGalley. It's a story about Fae, so I hadn't read it. I thought I'd check out the first book. It's also kind of a Beauty and the Beast retelling at the same time. And in that aspect, I thought it worked quite well. Our main character has a bit of spunk. She kind of flits back and forth here and there, but for the most part, she's an entertaining and engaging character. The world's peopled with attractive Fae lords as well, so what's not to like about that? And there was plenty of action and adventure. This is a book that overall I enjoyed. I gave it 4 stars, and I would be interested in going on and reading book 2 now that I've finished book 1. Next up, The Perfect World of Miwako Sumida by Clarissa Goenawan. And this was a 4.5-star read for me. This is a book about a group of people, and one of their number has apparently committed suicide, and the main guy finds this hard to believe and decides to investigate, and discovers things along the way about himself as well as about his friend, who he didn't know as well as he thought he did. There's a great discussion about identity in this. We have a trans character who's, I think, quite well portrayed, and it kind of looks at both the negatives and positives to the way the treatment like that character receives from society and those around them. And overall, definitely, it's worth a read. Again, it's a fairly short piece, but it's a really interesting contemporary novel looking at ideas of identity and belonging, and do we really know ourselves, let alone other people, is probably a major theme in it. Next up, I read A Man. This was a 4-star read for me. It's by, I should say, Keiichiro Hirano. It's a Japanese story. And this is also about sort of investigating death in a way, a bit like the last book. One of the characters has married a man in a small village. He's a newcomer to the village. She's lived there all her life. And only after he dies does she come to discover that he was using an assumed name. She has an acquaintance who is an investigator, a detective, and she asks him to look into this. And he begins to investigate, and along the way he discovers a kind of ring of identity theft. But more than that, he finds himself questioning why someone would want to change their name and swap identities with someone else, and sort of positives and negatives that would come from that. Again, it's a very short book, but an interesting psychological character study kind of piece again, so definitely worth reading. Next up is Stories for the Years by Pirandello. As with the Chekhov earlier, Pirandello is a writer I know mostly from plays. We studied 6 characters in search of an author when I was at university, and I'd never actually realised he wrote other stuff as well, but he did write fiction. And this is a collection of some of his short stories, and they were a 4.5-star read for me. The stories are quirky. There's elements of Italian folklore mingled in with them. Very memorable characters, great little pieces, nicely paced, really sharp, clear writing, concise. Definitely worth checking out if you're a fan of short stories and would like a sort of little bit of an overview of some Italian folklore along the way. Next up, we're going back to Japan for Spark by Matayoshi Naoki. And this was a 3.5-star read for me. This book is about two manzai, I think is the word, manzai, comedic actors. This is a style of comedy where you have a straight character and a stupid character and they play off each other. It's not something I'm particularly familiar with as a comedy style. I've never seen any Japanese manzai before. And I think that's, for me, is why the story didn't perhaps click as much as it might have. It's a huge phenomenon, this book, in Japan, apparently. And I don't know if it's already a Netflix series or if the Netflix series is starting soon, but it's being filmed. And we have a fairly newbie comedian who hooks up with a more experienced but yet not famous mentor. And it's kind of a discussion on the nature of comedy in some ways, and again on relationships and identity and belonging, very typical themes for a lot of fiction at the moment. And I didn't dislike it, but I think I lost a lot of the nuance because of my lack of knowledge about the comedic style and the background and cultural aspects. So I wouldn't actually mind perhaps checking it out on Netflix, because perhaps watching it and seeing the comedy in action would help. So if you know a bit about this style of comedy, then it's definitely a book that you'll enjoy. If you don't, it's still worth reading. It's still interesting, but you may find, like me, you're perhaps not getting all the subtle jokes and things that a native audience would. And we're on to the last one, which is The Ardent Swarm by Yamen Manai. This is a 4-star read for me. This is also another fairly allegorical book. The basic story is about a beekeeper. He is in Tunisia, and this is after the Arab Spring. And all he wants to do is protect his bees. But various threats arrive in the form of, for example, an imported giant hornet from Asia. And the basic premise really is that these bees are an allegory for what's happening in his country. And as a reader, I got that in broad strokes. And there's action playing out in the world, in the human world as well, with various political groups and military guerrilla bands and things. So it's a commentary on the situation in the country after the Arab Spring. And I can get that allegory from the bees as well. But again, I think I don't know a lot about it. So I'm probably missing some of the nuances that, if you knew a lot more about the situation in Tunisia, would mean more to you. But even so, as I said, it was 4 stars. It was an enjoyable read. I liked the story. I learned a bit more about beekeeping as well as the Tunisian social political situation. But you probably would get even more from it if you were more familiar with the region and the recent events of the last few years or so. So that kind of brings me to the end of my books. I just need to have a quick sip of drink because I'm getting a bit dry. But before I go today, I thought I would also just do a little bit of a roundup on where I am, because we are one day away from the middle of the year. And what's my reading progress been like? Well, I've actually finished my own challenge, the MJM Book Challenge 2020. I have it here, which I don't know how well you'll be able to see that, but I've finished ticking off all these books, one for each of my 25 categories. So that challenge is over and done with. As you may also know, I'm doing a World Reading Challenge, and I'll just do a quick tot-up of the numbers, but 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4. So far this year, I've read 4 more books, crossing off 4 more countries from that challenge. This is one that I just created myself again as well, and there's not a deadline on it. I'm not trying to do it by the end of the year. I started it last year, And I just want to keep going basically until I have read a book written by an author born in every country in the world, if it's at all possible. I may find as I get down to some of the like tiny nations that it gets a bit harder. But I'm doing reasonably well at the moment. So I shall continue with that. And finally, in terms of my Goodreads challenge, I actually set my challenge initially at 180 books, which is roughly where I put it most years, 150, 180. However, it was very clear I was going to smash that in no time. So I have upped it to 250. And I have so far read 152. So I'm at something like 61%, I think it was, when I last looked, at halfway through the year. So I am on track to get the 250, although I would note that I did read a fair bit of manga in some of the early months this year, and I'm now up to date with all the ones of those I was reading. And obviously reading manga volumes boosts your book numbers quite substantially fairly quickly. So it may be a bit tighter as we move through those last 6 months to get to the 250, but we'll see. I shall aim for it at least. I think that's about all. In terms of my TBR pile, I'm actually nearly through it. I'm reading a NetGalley book at the moment, which I should finish by tomorrow night. And after that, I will be starting the final book from my Christmas haul, which is Lost Illusions by Balzac. And then I'm currently up to date. I do have a few books on request at NetGalley, a couple on request from publishers as print arcs. And my mother told me the other day she's just sent me a few books as a gift because she bought something for my sister. So to be fair and equal to us both, she usually sends me some money or buys me something in exchange. And so I have a few books coming from her. There were also a few I'd like to get, but some of them are coming out late July, early August. So I'm going to wait until mid-August before I order those. So I will have some new ones coming in. But for now, I am pretty much up to date and with my TBR pile. If I have time and I don't get any sudden surge of NetGalley requests granted or anything, I'm thinking about rereading the Winter Night trilogy. It's a book series I really love, and it's suitable weather for it. It's winter here in Australia at the moment. So if I get a chance, I might give that a quick reread as well during July. But we'll see what happens and what new books I end up getting in the next few weeks. So I will end there for today, but I'll be back again next month with another of these wrap-ups. I'll be back before then in the meantime with a bit of other content for you. I have a few things scheduled on my YouTube channel which will go live during July. Plus in mid-July, Alina Popescu and I, my good friend Alina in Romania, have another one of our Genre Talk live streams. So I really hope you will join us for that as well. And I think we are on Alina's channel this time. Yes, I think so. We're on Alina's channel, I believe. So do come along then. And I will see you all again very soon with another vlog. Bye for now, everyone.